Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, a guy who does tend to overdo things, which is why you, dear viewers, get to enjoy a second video on falling fifth sequences. This time around, our examples are going to have much higher levels of chromaticism than the ones in Lesson 40. But I want to start with a quick rewind. Here is a sequence we studied near the end of the previous video. It's from the first book of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, and it shows the sort of upper limit of chromaticism from that lesson. Its backbone, you may remember, is diatonic. Each chunk of the sequence starts with a first inversion triad in the key of E flat major. 4-6, 3-6, 2-6, and 1-6. But the last three of these are each preceded by their own dominant seventh. And you can see from the accidentals that two of those, being applied dominant sevenths, introduce a bunch of notes from outside the key, chromatic notes. And the fact that the chromatic chords are dominants reminds us of an important point. Chromatic chords are usually dissonant chords, and dissonance drives harmony. Listen to what happens if I take out the chromatic harmonies. Here is the completely diatonic version of the progression. And here it is again with the chromatic chords reinstated. Maybe you noticed that the harmony in that second version just has more life. The chromatic chords make the diatonic ones really pop. If you didn't, keep your ears peeled when I play the actual performance. Well, as it turns out, applied dominant sevenths can play a much bigger part in falling fifth sequences, leading to some dense and colorful harmony. But I want to ease us into this with a passage from one of Mozart's last piano concertos. Here is a harmless little theme from the opening movement of K503. When I play it, notice two things. First, it's a parallel period that uses completely conventional harmony, with one exception. And that exception is the second thing. In the consequent phrase, notice that Mozart chromatically alters exactly one chord tone. This A natural becomes an A flat. So try to hear the effect that that has on the color of the passage. So what's that one chromatic note doing there? Well, the chord symbols show us that when Mozart lowers A to A flat, he changes the quality of his 2-4-2 chord. Instead of a minor seventh chord, it becomes the half-diminished 2-4-2 that we know from minor keys. And the effect is just a slight darkening, a little touch of shadow. Now, this is something composers do all the time, but here Mozart does it to plant a seed, to foreshadow something much more dramatic that happens when this period comes back. When we hear it again, the antecedent is reorchestrated, but otherwise pretty much the same. But in the consequent phrase, that one chromatic note, the A flat, throws the theme completely off course, and that's where we find our chromatic falling fifth sequence. Let's start just by listening. So what just happened? We got to a half cadence in C major, but just barely. The first thing to notice is that despite the dizzying turn the harmony takes, the chord roots in the sequence do fall by fifth. Just not in C major. At first, the chain of roots suggests maybe F minor, then with a turn to C minor when that D natural creeps in. And as it turns out, this is right. The second half of the sequence is basically just in C minor. But before we talk about that, notice as well the figured bass pattern. It's all seventh chords alternating third and first inversion. Now, video 40 explains that this should create a stepwise bass descent, and it does. So this is obviously related to simpler sequences we've seen before. But again, there's this wrinkle that half of the sequence is in the parallel minor key. The second copy starts with the subtonic 7th chord, that's big Roman numeral 7, and winds its way back to tonic, where the chromaticism carries right over into the cadential progression. But the beginning of the sequence doesn't fit cleanly into C major or C minor. And it turns out the best way to untangle it is to work backwards from the C minor portion, which starts with that uppercase 7-4-2 chord. Now, if you remember lesson 33, you'll know that this chord actually has two names. Yes, it can be big Roman numeral 7, but we can also think of it as 5-7 of 3 because it has a dominant quality. And I'm suggesting that we relabel it here for reasons we'll see in a second. If we go back one chord, we find an F dominant 7th chord. And that, you probably know, is the dominant of B flat. So the chord that ends the first copy is 5-7 of 5-7 of 3. And if we go backwards again, you guessed it, we have C dominant 7th, which in this context acts like 5-7 of 5-7 of 5-7 of 3. And it's this technique, using consecutive dominant 7th chords, one resolving into the next, that'll be the focus in the next few examples. But to wrap this one up, we still have two more chords to analyze. Moving backwards, we have a G half diminished 7th, which is also not in the key of C, and which I think we're supposed to hear as 2-6 of F. And then before that is a D flat major 7th chord, which is a decidedly weird variant of the 2 chord we normally get in that spot. It's also the chord that contains that A flat, but now with a much darker harmonic effect. Let's think about this for a second. In both versions of the theme, the antecedent is purely diatonic, all sweetness and light. Then the first consequent phrase lets a chromatic shadow pass over. But this later consequent phrase goes entirely dark, sending us off on a flatward tangent that almost completely obscures the original C major tonic. Try to home in on that sense of tonal disorientation when we hear the second version of the theme again with antecedent and consequent. Now, at this point, you'll probably be glad to know that our next few examples are a lot simpler than this one, in that their sequences use only dominant 7th chords. I call it the all 5-7 model, and we'll see it first in a passage from Mozart's K421 quartet. The movement as a whole is in D minor, but the middle section is in A minor. And as it comes to a close, we think we're going to get a PAC in that key, like this. But Mozart decides to evade the cadence, replacing that minor tonic with a dominant 7th chord. Now, if you watched video 30, you'll know that when a tonic turns into a dominant 7th, it's usually 5-7 of 4, as I've shown here. But it turns out that this dominant 7th is the first of many in a sequential chain. But before we start worrying about Roman numerals, let's just get the chords themselves down, lead sheet style. The model takes us from A7 to D7. Then the first copy takes us from G7 to C7. And then there's a half copy where F7 resolves to just a plain old B flat major triad. Now, depending on the day of the week, my analysis might just stop with those labels. There's nothing wrong with just going lead sheet when the harmony gets crazy. But if we want to connect this sequence to the bigger picture, we need to understand what it's doing. And what it's doing is taking us from A minor back to the tonic D minor, where we land on a half cadence. So if we wanted to, we could hear the whole sequence as a chain of applied 5/7s bearing down on that B flat major 6 chord in the original key. Now, with all this said, I need you to know that I would never, ever, in public or in private, actually refer to this chord as 5/7 of 5/7 of 5/7 of 5/7 of 5/7 of 6. That's just stupid. Life is way too short. The thing is, in situations like this, the labels don't matter nearly as much as the sound. And this progression has a very distinct sound, thanks to something we're going to see in the two upper voices. Way back in video 15, we learned that every dominant seventh contains a tritone, an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, and that tritone, being made of tendency tones, is supposed to resolve in contrary motion when the dominant goes to tonic. Well, when a dominant seventh resolves into another dominant seventh, the tritone does something different. It slides down by semitone instead, giving the next 5/7 its tritone. So when you have a chain of 5/7s like this, you'll always have a series of tritones sliding down by half step. In this case, it starts with the E dominant that sets up the cadence. G sharp and D slide down to G and C sharp. Then G leaps up an octave and we slide through 4 more tritones. It's an extremely distinctive sound, and one you can easily learn to hear even when you add the actual bass line. So listen for those sliding tritones when I play you an actual recording. These sliding tritones are even easier to see in this phrase from the trio of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The key is G flat major, and the second 4 bars just use tonic and dominant. But we lead into this with a falling fifth sequence that uses only 5/7s. It ends with the regular 5/7 of the key, which is prepared by its dominant, which is prepared by its dominant, which is prepared by its dominant. And Beethoven has voiced these chords so that the sliding tritones are isolated in the pianist's left hand. Now, this example has 2 things in common with the Mozart. One, the chords of the falling fifth sequence may be chromatic, but the chord roots themselves are all part of the prevailing key. And number 2, the sequence itself has a functional off-ramp. It deposits us on a functional chord in the surrounding key. Here it was tonic, in the Mozart it was 6. Well, neither of these is the case in this parallel period from one of Chopin's last mazurkas. We're in B flat major here, and the phrase opens with just 5/7s and 1s. Then the sequence starts, and it is by far the longest of the ones we'll see today that use only dominant sevenths. By comparison, Beethoven had a model and 1 copy. Mozart had an extra half copy, but Chopin has 3 full copies. He starts on a G dominant 7th and eventually goes so far around the circle of perfect fifths that the chord roots end up leaving the key. And notice as well that those sliding tritones are clearly audible at the top of the texture. Now, this is already a lot weirder than the Mozart and the Beethoven, but notice what happens when we try to put Roman numerals on this thing. We get 5/7 of 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 C flat? But then there is no C flat. Chopin never resolves any of these dominants properly. He just sort of abandons the sequence midstream, without a cadence, mind you, and then just starts the consequent phrase over in the second system. It's like he got in over his head or something and said, the hell with it. So we're going back to lead sheet notation in this one. Thankfully, Chopin doesn't make the same mistake in the consequent phrase. It starts the same way, but then the sequence is shorter. And crucially, it also abandons the all-dominant seventh principle. The last chord in the sequence is actually a diminished seventh chord instead. And that diminished seventh is 7/7 of 5, taking us right into the cadence. So here's the whole thing. So next up are two variants of the all 5/7 model of falling fifth sequences. I call the first one the big chunk variety, and you'll see why in a second. You see these a lot specifically in Mozart's development sections or in passages that have a generally developmental flavor. The chords are still all 5/7s, and the roots still fall by fifth. But there are three really big differences. One is that the model tends to be much longer than the sequences we've seen today, like 3 or 4 bars as opposed to 1 or 2. Second, the model and each copy feature only one chord, not the 2 chords we've seen in literally every sequence so far. And finally, this type of sequence has no clear directionality, by which I mean it doesn't have an obvious rising or falling contour. Let me show you. Here is a passage from Mozart's C minor piano concerto. It's built from 3 repetitions of a 4-bar idea, a model and 2 copies. And each of them prolongs a single dominant 7th chord. The first one prolongs 5/7 of B flat. The second prolongs 5/7 of E flat. And then the third one, 5/7 of A flat. And when I play you the recording, I hope you'll notice 2 things. One is that this big sequence is surrounded by smaller sequences. We lead in with a descending third sequence and then out with a rising step sequence. And second, notice the distinct feel that this big chunk style sequence creates. Normal sequences are about motion and direction and dynamism, but this type is an engine that slowly and methodically builds tension. So our next 2 sequences also only use dominant 7ths, but they introduce a new factor. These sequences use what jazz theorists would call altered or extended dominants, which is to say dominants that have upper partials like ninths, or have chromatically altered notes like a raised chordal fifth. And the first of the 2 is from a song by Fauré. In English, the title is At the Edge of the Water, and the sequence falls in the middle of a phrase where the soprano sings about smelling sweet flowers. And the chords themselves are definitely fragrant. Now, there are several ways you could go about analyzing this, but I hear it taking us from E major into C sharp minor, beginning with a functional progression. Tonic with a sharpened fifth, then a predominant, then 5/7 with a sharpened fifth. Then the sequence mixes that type of altered dominant with ones that have added ninths. And from there, there's a quick pivot into C sharp minor for the cadence. My other example here is by Liszt from the character piece Il Penseroso, and it basically gives us the same sequence twice, once leading into an evaded cadence and then again leading into a PAC. But there's a slight difference between the two sequences. The first one alternates regular dominant sevenths with dominants that have a flat 9 added, but in the second one, all 4 dominants have flat 9s added. It's a pretty lugubrious passage, but it does let you really savor these almost jazz-like sonorities. Now, to get us into our next topic, I want to take a moment to look more closely at these 4 chords in particular. Here is a simplification that shows the 5 distinct voices that make up the texture. Now, obviously, these flattened ninths above the bass make these chords more dissonant than regular dominants. But they do more than that. Notice here that the 2 voices in the middle staff contain the sliding tritones we'd expect when 5/7s are chained together. Well, the added ninths, which I've shown in red here, actually create a second pair of sliding tritones up there in the top staff. So we've kind of doubled down on the thing that gives 5/7 chains their distinctive sound. But there's more. If you take the bass line out entirely, what's left, what these tritone pairs create, are fully diminished 7th chords sliding down by half step. Now, that is in itself a pretty familiar sound, and it's also one that turns up now and again in sequences. Let's go back to Mozart's C minor concerto. This is the main theme now, and the sequence I want to look at starts 3 bars in. I'm going to let you hear the whole theme first, and as I play it, I'll plug in all the other harmonic information. Then we'll home in on the sequence itself. Now, before anyone flips out, I just want to confirm that yes, however unlikely it seems, I'm calling 7 diminished 4/2 a predominant here. We've never seen it used that way before, and it's not super common. I've only got 8 instances in my archives, but it is a thing, and now you know. Anyway, the sequence. Apart from the first chord, all of the sonorities are fully diminished 7ths sliding down by half step. Now, if we add the chord roots based on Mozart's spelling, it's clear that they don't fall consistently by 5th, but it still feels like a falling 5th sequence to me. And the reason, I think, is because we have those sliding tritones that are the calling card of the all 5/7 model. But now we've got them in pairs. And in fact, we could, I'm not saying this is a good idea, but we could add a falling 5th bass line of our own, and the result would be a sequence just like the one we saw in Liszt, with all dominant flat 9 chords. Now, obviously, Mozart would never write anything that dissonant, but this little thought experiment helps us understand the very close similarity of this sequence to the ones made of all dominant sevenths. Because effectively, it is a falling fifth sequence, just one whose bass line is missing. How's that for convoluted reasoning? Anyway, the only other point I want to make here is that while it's true that Mozart's chord roots don't make a falling fifth pattern, I also think this is one of these unusual contexts where the roots kind of don't matter at all. What matters here, I think, is sheer sonority, the diminished seventhness, and the way they move, the downward chromatic slide that mimics many features of a 5/7 chain. And this includes the sense that each diminished seventh chord, quote-unquote, resolves into the next, even though there is no resolution and everything is dissonant. Let's listen to the whole thing one more time. So, on the topic of sequences whose chord roots might not matter as much as sonority and voice leading, our last and probably most interesting example is the 8-bar sentence that opens Chopin's very first mazurka. And as it happens, the whole thing is sequential. The basic idea has 5/7 resolving to 1. Then the repetition is just the same thing, up a third in the relative major. It's a very Chopin move. And then the second half is the falling sequence we're going to pick apart. Have a listen first and enjoy the uneven meter of the mazurka as performed by a Polish expert. And then we'll zoom in on bars 5 through 8. So here is a simplification of bars 5 through 8, with the chords just before and just after the sequence added at each end. Notice first that the chord roots do in fact fall by fifth all the way through, and at the expected rate of 2 per unit, despite the fact that the model and copies have 3 chords each. As for chord quality, the model and copies start with half diminished seventh chords, move on to dominant sevenths, and then finished with diminished sevenths. Only the last copy is different. There's an extra half diminished seventh which loops us back into the 5/7 that starts the consequent phrase. Now, if we want to make harmonic sense of this sequence, we might start by focusing on the first 2 chords in each model and copy. Because what we find is that we have a 2/7 to 5/7 motion in 4 minor keys, each a whole step lower than the last. But we might feel that this is a little contrived, right? Do we really hear 4 key changes in 5 bars? So imagine instead that we try to make a coherent chain out of these. We could do something like this, where each 2/5 motion resolves into the 2 chord that starts the next 2/5 motion. But this is just nonsense. I mean, are we really supposed to think of this first chord as 2 half diminished 4/3 of 2 of 2 of 2 of G minor, a key that has like exactly 0 relevance here? And even if we did think this was a good idea, we'd still have to figure out what to make of those diminished seventh chords at the end of each bar, because they certainly don't resolve like any functional chords we know. So even though we can find a falling fifth root pattern here, this sequence just doesn't want to be analyzed with Roman numerals and such. Instead, and kind of like the Mozart concerto we just saw, it might make more sense to focus on sonority and motion. Now, in this case, we've got more types of sonorities, right? 3 types instead of 1, but the voice-leading mechanics are exactly the same. Remember that Mozart's sequence was built from diminished seventh chords sliding down by half step. anytime a chordal voice moved, it went down by half step. Well, the same thing is true here. All of Chopin's voice leading is by descending half step. The difference is that Mozart moves everyone all at once, whereas Chopin breaks up this motion into 3 distinct moves, so to speak, each of them with only 2 or 3 voices moving at once. We can see this more easily if I add color. Every unit starts on a half diminished seventh. Then the outer voices slide down, making a dominant seventh. After that, the 3 upper voices slide down, making a diminished seventh. And then finally, the 3 bottom voices slide down, bringing us to another half-diminished sonority. And the result is a kind of harmony that the scholar Mark Devoto famously called creeping chromaticism. It's an entirely different species of harmony, and one that takes on a life of its own as the 19th century unfolds. One thinks especially of Wagner's late operas, where big, dissonant chords just morph into each other as the voices slither around by semitone. It's really a different thing from the kind of functional harmony that we study in this series. And it relates to a broader trend in which composers found new ways to connect chords based on voice leading rather than on function or root movement. It's the kind of thing that usually only gets talked about by professional analysts, but I thought it worked nicely as a way to wrap up this lesson. So here's the whole theme again. And that's all for today, folks. Up next, I think, is, please don't kill me, one more video about falling fifth sequences, but this one wouldn't be classical music. It would be about other genres, with a special focus on music that I heard in the air around me as a child. It might not be for everybody, but I'm still tempted. We'll have to see.